I'm here to talk to you about the Scots language. Now, it's the language that I grew up talking. So I'm going to start talking to you for my first day at school. So for the first day at school, the very first lesson at the school we learnt was you can't talk right. Can't talk right. So we went in and the hulls weren't hulls, the mountains weren't mountains, the woods wasn't woods. All the names of the animals were wrong. Dugs wasn't dugs, owls wasn't owls, stuckies wasn't stuckies, craws, pleeps, coos, doos, furrets, all this was wrong. And for that, it wasn't just that. My house wasn't a house or a hame. In my own body, my arms weren't arms, my horns weren't horns. My fingers wasn't my fingers, my foot wasn't my foot, my heart wasn't my heart, my head wasn't my head. When it came to what you'd done in life, you couldn't loup a burn, you couldn't dreep off a wall in the middens at the back, you couldn't juke through a hole in a dike, you couldn't jink out the way, you couldn't even have a glass of water. So all us at the school, we were given an old tobacco tin for us to write down all these new exotic words we were learning, like foot, hand, head. Stuck them in the tobacco tin. Now, sometimes some of your words would get in. You'd get words like cat. Is that allowed in? Yes, cat's fine. Then you would say, what about burn? And they'd say, well, sometimes, but that small river that goes outside the school, that's called a stream. But most of the time, you'd put your horn up and you'd be like that. Miss, how do you spell et? And they'd say, no, et isn't a word. It's ate or have eaten. Right? So I'm not here to gurn and greet about what happened to me. This lesson was getting learnt by Wains all over Scotland that same day. Tens of thousands of Wains all over Scotland. And millions of folk afore us were told, you can't talk right. So, I stuck in at the English. I kept, over the years, I internalised that wee tobacco tin and put all my good English words in. Went through education, get better. But at home, I still used all these words with my family, my friends, my neighbours. And you always kind of wonder, where's the tin for that? What's the name of these words that aren't allowed? These words you can't use. Right, so before I came up to Inverness the day, I taken a wee look at a guidebook. Right, I've been here hundreds of times, but I thought I'll tag one of these wee guidebooks down here, look at it. Right, so it was a tour of Scotland, 1677, by a fellow called Thomas Kirk for Yorkshire. And in this book, he mentions Inverness. He's on his way to Orkney, and he just mentions it, and he says, in Inverness and the surrounding areas, and most of the Highlands, people speak a sort of wild Irish. But some of the better sort speak Scottish, right? So he's not a good traveller, really, slagging everybody as he goes about. But you're like, that Scottish, that is the word that used to be used for all these words that I can't use, that were taught through education. No, you can't say that. So in the Scottish, it's called Scots, right? And before the 18th century, all over Scotland, in the Lowlands, and even in Inverness, folk spoke Scots and they were quite happy. That's what I do. I talk Scots. All my words are right. Grand, go on with it. And if you look at the old borough records for Inverness, which then was called Inverness, no Inverness, you'll find all these words that I wasn't allowed to put in that wee tobacco tin. You'll find like head, horn, foot, cowp, scabbit. You'll find guerdon, merket, council, court, all these words that you weren't allowed. They're all in there. Said, what happened? What happened to make Scotland say that all these words are wrong, all these words that are just not right? Well, if you were to push me, it's pretty complex, but if you were to push me, I'd say Adam Smith, the father of economics. Right? So folk mind him for A Wealth of Nations, the book, found it economics in Glasgow and Edinburgh. But what he was in real life was he was a professor of rhetoric. And what he done at the end of his life, he said to his pals, he said, see, when I'm dead, take all my manuscripts and fling them in the fire. A Perfect, A Wealth of Nations, and a treatise on moral sentiment. Right, so all his books, all the work, everything he taught got flung in the fire. But his most popular book, whilst he was alive, one of them anyway, was his 1748 Lectures on Rhetoric and Bell Letters. And we've still got copies of that because it was so popular. And if you look at that, you'll find he's teaching folk how to talk properly. And he doesn't mention Scots, right? But what he says is, the language spoken in the Low Countries of Scotland is now, and has been for hundreds of years, nothing but a dialect of English, right? Now, it doesn't sound that big a deal, that sentence, now, but if you think he was actually talking to folk, they all thought they spoke this language called Scots. They all talked Scots. So Scotland was affronted with this. They were like, we don't talk a real language, right? And later on in the book, he says the same for the Gaelic. He says, Irish, Welsh, and the Erse, that's the Gaelic, are nothing but dialects of the same language, right? So all of a sudden in these lectures, this is the most intellectual guy in Scotland, as he's seen at the time, wipes out both of the languages of Scotland, Gaelic and Scots. So the response to this for Scotland was in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen. What they done was they all tried to go through elocution lessons with 300 years of elocution in Scotland, all trying to get folk to talk right. So what they done at first was they tried to imitate the language of the south of England. So had they been successful, I would perhaps be speaking to you something like this. But what we know now about psychology and neuroscience is your first accent, the accent that you get when you're born, is pretty fixed, and it's awfully hard to change that accent, the vowel sounds you make, the consonants you make. So what they done after that, after about 10 years of trying that, was they ta'en Scots language, they flung out all the words that didn't kind of match up with the language of the south of England. And then the words they had left, they swapped about all the vowel sounds and the consonants, and they put in new consonants. So, hon, you change that to han, and then you put a D in the end, handa, right? So they changed this wee kernel, this wee bit that was left in the language. And they called that, coming mainly out of Edinburgh, the Athens of the North, they called that Attic. That was the name for this language. It was like English with a Scottish accent. And then they called all the other Scots languages Doric, right, which meant outside Athens. So to the east of here, they weren't soft. They went, right, no bother, that's it, we talk Doric, we talk the Doric, and they didn't change the way they spoke. But through the rest of Scotland, all the way from Shetland down to the borders, what they done was that this Doric went out of fashion, and it changed to corrupt language, bad language, bastardization. All these words are used to educate folk on how to talk, right? To the day you hear scum speak, folk talk about that in Glasgow, the scum speak that goes on. So that is all Scots. It is a language. It was a language. And this Attic, it's a constructed language. But now there's been generations and generations of folk talking it. So it's just as much a language as Scots and Gaelic. Now, all this was done without a single scale for a foundation on science, right? And that was what was meant to be going on in that 18th century time. It was meant to be everything's about science, but they didn't found it in science. So what I'm going to do now is tell you a wee bit about the neuroscience of what's going on with language, right? So I'll tell you, language, you look at it, it's a behaviour, and it's something that goes on in the brain. So I'll tell you about the first time that I held a human brain, right? So years and years and years of study, I knew all the parts of the brain. I seen it sitting there. I could say, oh, there's the central sulcus. That's the frontal lobes, temporal lobes. You can see the pons, the cerebellum, and like that. Great. And I taken it into my hands, and it hurt me. I realised that this was a woman. This bit of tissue taking the decision to leave its body to science so that we could look at it and learn more about the brain and try and prevent degenerative brain diseases. This bit of tissue in my hand was all the memories and all the life experience of this woman's lifetime. And in it was every single word that she kent. So, were you say to her something like, let's say a name of somebody at the pictures, like John Wayne, right? What would happen would be the temporal lobe, this kind of area here, would activate. There'd be some facial recognition, a bit of visual stuff while she recalls what John Wayne looks like. But if you were to say to her the name of your daughter, the same things would happen, but the full of the brain would get recruited. All the areas to do with how the muscles work would mind on what she felt like when she picked her up out the cot. Everything to do with her smell or sense of smell, she would mind what she smelt like. She would mind what she tasted like when she kissed her. All that comes in, the full brain comes into activation. And that's how words and language work in the brain. They take all these different bits of the brain and they start going to work, right? So if you were to say to me something like slide rule, my auditory cortex and my visual areas would come in. I've never used a slide rule, but if you say to an old engineer, in his brain, all the bits to do with moving fingers, the parts to do with maths would come in, maybe some fond memory of his first slide rule would come in. So what does this mean for Scots? Right. So if you were to say to me something like the dog, right? What would happen in my brain would be maybe the same stuff, auditory cortex coming in, a wee bit of visual, maybe what a dog feels like. But if you were to say to me the dog, what would happen would be all the memories of all the dogs that I've had and all the dogs that I've kent over my lifetime. Moss, Tara, Duke, Fury, Wee Blue, Mosey, all these dogs that I've kent would come in. And the parts of my brain that were to do with claws, digging into my skin, the smell of it, the taste of it when it licked your face, all that kind of stuff, all that gets recruited, right? So that's the difference between dog and Doug. And in my brain, you've got all these words, thousands and thousands and thousands of words that aren't allowed. Dreich, doer, sprachelen, it goes on and on and on. I can't list all them. But they're all in my brain. And Scots speakers, all over Scotland, have the words in their brain. And what the brain is, if you're studying language out here, it's a bunch of sounds and marks and paper. But in the brain, what language is it's the way that we can affect and read one another's minds. It's the tools that we have for our inventions and our imaginations. It's the tools that are available for us. So when you're getting told all your words are wrong, it's worse than tying a hona in the back. Really, really is. So that language is there in Scotland for everybody to use. If you're out, whether you talk it yourself or no, you need to be aware of it. If you're an artist, it's there for you. If you're a poet, an author, an actor, you should learn about it. Have it as part of your repertoire. If you're a teacher or a doctor or a therapist or a counsellor, think about how, if you're working with somebody that talks Scots, think about how you can bring all this in to make you better at what you do. If you're a designer, if you're an engineer, if you're a technologist, we're shifting into a planet where everything is going to be about voice recognition and nothing is getting built for the Scots language. So our language, Scots and Gaelic, both naturally evolved with the physical, emotional and intellectual landscape of Scotland. It's there, it's powerful. Use it. We've got to drop this 18th century way of looking at our language. We've got to start talking about our language.